The most complete confession a man can make is the thing he refuses to say. Attributed to no one, found written in the margin of a ledger recovered from the Harlan County Sheriff's Office, 1923. A note on method. What follows is a reconstruction. It is not, in the strict sense, a biography. There are no diaries, there is no confession, there is no deathbed whisper preserved by a faithful nurse, no letter discovered behind wallpaper in a house since demolished. What we have, instead, are the spaces, the gaps between what people remember and what the records confirm, the silences that persist, even when the person at their center had every reason, social, legal, moral, to speak. The man at the center of this account was named Elias Cord. He was born in 1881 in a small mining community in the hill country of eastern Kentucky, the second of 4 sons, and he died in 1949 in the same county where he was born, in a house he had built with his own hands, in a room that looked out over a ridge he had looked at for most of his life. He was 67 years old. He had outlived 3 wars, a depression, the deaths of 2 brothers, and most significantly, the deaths of 11 men with whom he had traveled, worked, eaten, and slept during a period of approximately 14 months between 1914 and 1916. He never spoke about what happened to them, not once, not in any way that anyone, in any document we have recovered, was able to verify or use. He was asked many times. This is the story of his silence and what that silence contains. Harlan County, Kentucky, spring, 1916. The first confirmed record of Elias Cord's return to Harlan County after his absence is a notation in the ledger of the Belfry General Store, dated April 14, 1916. The entry reads only, E. Cord, credit restored, 1 lb flour, salt pork, lamp oil. The handwriting is that of the store's proprietor, a man named Garfield Munn, who was 61 at the time, and who would later describe, in a 1931 interview conducted by a reporter from the Lexington Herald, the moment Elias Cord walked back into his store. He came in quiet, Munn said, like a dog that's been in a fight and don't want to show it. You could see he was thinner. His hands shook some. I asked him where he'd got to because folks had wondered. He looked at me for a long time, longer than was comfortable, I'll tell you. And then he said he'd been working. I asked working where. He said, out west some, down south some. I asked him what happened to the Reardon boys, because they'd gone with him and nobody'd heard a word. He picked up his things and he said, I don't know, Garfield, and then he walked out. Munn paused in the interview. The reporter noted that the old man looked out the window before continuing. He knew, Munn said simply. I could tell that he knew. Elias Cord did not go directly home after leaving Munn's store. This is established by the testimony of a woman named Cora Bledsoe, who lived on the road between the store and the Cord family property. She saw him that afternoon, she said, standing at the fence line that bordered her late husband's tobacco field, looking at the ground, not looking at anything in particular, just standing and looking down, as though he'd dropped something and couldn't remember what it was. I called to him, she told the same reporter in 1931. I said, Elias, is that you? And he looked up and he smiled, and it was a kind smile. I don't want you to think it wasn't, but there was something wrong with it, like a smile he'd borrowed from someone else and hadn't yet figured out how to wear. She asked him where he'd been. He said he'd been traveling. She asked after his brother Ned, who had gone with him. He said Ned was fine. Ned was not fine. Ned Cord had been dead for at least 3 months by that point, a fact Elias knew and which his family would not learn for another 6 weeks when a letter arrived, not from Elias, but from a county clerk in New Mexico whose name has been partially obscured by water damage in the surviving copy, notifying the family that one Edward Cord had died in February of 1916 of causes listed as injury and exposure. When the family confronted Elias with this letter, he read it. He folded it carefully. He handed it back. He said, I'm sorry. Nothing more. Not then. Not ever. We must be precise about what Elias Cord did and did not do in the weeks following his return, because precision is the only tool we have against the gravity of assumption. He did not flee. He did not drink to excess. though his father did and his brothers were known to, and the social permission for a man in his condition to seek that particular oblivion was widely available to him. He did not become violent. He did not weep publicly. He attended church 4 times in the month of May 1916, which was more than he had attended in any single month before his disappearance, and he sat in the same pew each time near the back, and he bowed his head during the prayers, and he did not take communion. He did not speak to the sheriff, though the sheriff came to see him twice. He did not respond to a letter from a man named Chester Reardon, the father of 2 of the men who had gone with him, except through a short note written in pencil on the back of an envelope, which read, "I am sorry for your loss. I cannot tell you what you want to know." Chester Reardon kept this note for the rest of his life. His daughter donated it to the Harlan County Historical Society in 1978. The curator at the time, a woman named Doris Feltner, who spent several years attempting to reconstruct the story of those 14 months, noted in her own unpublished manuscript that the note was the most careful document she had ever handled. "It is not evasive," she wrote. "He doesn't say he doesn't know. He says he cannot tell." That word, cannot, is doing an enormous amount of work. The 11 men who did not return were not all from the same family, though they were all from the same county, and they had all left together in the winter of 1914. Their names, drawn from various records, were Ned Cord, Thomas Cord, James Reardon, Caleb Reardon, Harold Munn, Porter Teague, Solomon Teague, Absalom Hensley, Roy Combs, Dillard Combs, and a man known in county records only as Watts, first name unknown, listed in the 1910 census as a boarder in the home of the Teague family. 12 men had left together. 1 had come back. He was 24 years old when he returned. He would live another 33 years. He would farm. He would marry, briefly and unsuccessfully, in 1920. He would serve as a deacon in his church from 1928 until his death. He would be, by all accounts, a quiet and decent man who helped his neighbors and was trusted with small responsibilities and never asked for more than he needed. He would never speak about where he had been or what had happened or why he alone had survived. And the silence he maintained was not the silence of a man who had forgotten, or a man who was broken, or a man who had failed to find the words. It was, as we shall attempt to demonstrate across the remaining sections of this account, the silence of a man who had thought very carefully about what he knew and had concluded, for reasons we cannot fully recover but can begin to understand, that the world was better off not knowing it. Harlan County, Kentucky, autumn and winter 1914. To understand a silence, you must first understand the voice it replaced. Elias Cord, before the winter of 1914, was not a silent man. The testimonies of those who knew him before his departure are unanimous on this point, with a consistency that makes it remarkable, because people rarely agree so completely about anything. His father called him a talker. His church's minister, a man named Brother Hadley, whose own records survive in the archive of a Baptist Historical Society in Louisville, described Elias in a 1913 membership document as a spirited young man of good humor and honest disposition. Cora Bledsoe, whose testimony we have already encountered, said in the same 1931 interview that Elias had been known for his laugh. "It was a loud laugh," she said. The kind that embarrassed him sometimes, because it would come out before he'd decided whether a thing was funny, like it had its own opinion. He was, by the evidence, a social creature in the way that men in close communities often are. Not charismatic in the manner of leaders, but comfortable, trusted, woven into the ordinary fabric of daily exchange. He was known to play the fiddle at community gatherings. He helped neighbors when asked, and sometimes when not asked. He was good with horses. He was, as his surviving brother Thomas would note in 1948 in one of the last interviews anyone conducted with a member of the immediate Cord family, the one who kept things light when they got heavy. If something went wrong, Thomas said, Thomas, who had not gone with the others in 1914 because he had broken his leg in October and was still mending, Elias was the one who'd find something almost funny about it, not in a mean way, in a way that let you breathe again. Thomas Cord died in 1948. the year before his brother. He was the last living person who had known Elias before the departure. The decision to leave Harlan County in the winter of 1914 was not, as is sometimes suggested in the fragmentary secondary literature on this case, a sudden or impulsive one. It had been building for at least 2 years, driven by the specific and well-documented economic pressures facing small farming and mining communities in eastern Kentucky during that period. The coal companies had tightened their grip on the region, and the independent small operators who had built the county's modest prosperity in the previous generation were being squeezed out by consolidation and by the kind of corporate pressure that made the air itself feel owned. There was work available, or so the stories said, in the territories to the west and southwest. Construction work, mining work, the kind of labor that required bodies and paid cash and asked no questions about where you'd come from. Several men in the county had already gone. Some had written back. The letters spoke of wages that sounded almost fictional to men who were struggling to feed their families on what the land and the local operators could offer. Elias Cord had been among the most enthusiastic advocates for going. This is documented not through his own words, but through the words of others who remembered the conversations. James Reardon's wife, a woman named Pauline, who outlived her husband by 42 years, and who was interviewed in 1958 by a graduate student from the University of Kentucky named Albert Prewitt, whose thesis was never completed but whose interview transcripts have survived, said that Elias had come to their house 3 times in the autumn of 1914 to talk with James about the plan. He was excited, Pauline Reardon said. He had a way of making things sound possible that maybe weren't. James was nervous about going. He had 2 boys then and he wasn't sure. But Elias would come over and he'd lay it all out, where they'd go, what they'd do, how long it would take. And by the time he left, you believed him. That was Elias. He made you believe the plan. She paused in the interview. After, she said, I thought about that a lot, about how he'd convinced James it was safe. She did not elaborate. Prewitt's notes indicate that he waited for her to continue, and that she did not. The relationship between Elias and his brother Ned requires its own consideration because it is central to what comes later, and because it was, by every account, the most significant bond in Elias's life. Ned Cord was 3 years younger than Elias, 20 at the time of the departure, and by the available descriptions he was almost his brother's opposite. Quieter, more cautious, more likely to stand at the edge of a room than to occupy its center. He was not timid. Multiple sources make this distinction clearly, but he thought before he spoke, and sometimes finished thinking before he decided not to speak at all. He had been in poor health as a child, though he had grown into a capable young man, and there remained around him, in the way his family spoke of him, the careful quality of something that had been repaired once and needed watching. He had not originally been part of the plan to go west. It was Elias who had talked him into it. This is established by the testimony of their father, a man named Crockett Cord, who spoke to the Harlan County Sheriff in May of 1916 in a conversation that was summarized, not transcribed, in the sheriff's notes, which survive in the county archive in fragmentary form. The summary reads, Father states Elias persuaded Edward to join the party. Father opposed. Elias said he would look after Edward. Father consented. And then, in a different ink that suggests it was added later, a single additional note, Father regrets consent. Crockett Cord died in 1919. He never spoke publicly about his son's absence or return. His wife had died earlier in 1912 before any of it happened, and there is something in that timing. The mother already gone, the father left to watch one son come home and another not, that the available records cannot quite contain. They left on December 3rd, 1914. This date is established by the notation in Garfield Munn's store ledger, which records the sale of supplies to the Cord party, 12 men on that date. The morning was cold. Several witnesses later remembered seeing the group assemble at the crossroads near the old Teague property. They had horses for the supplies and were mostly going to walk. They planned to pick up rail connections in the next county. Pauline Reardon was there to see her husband off. In the 1958 interview, she described the scene with a specificity that suggested she had returned to it often in the intervening decades. "James kissed me and he kissed the boys," she said. "And then Elias came over to me and he shook my hand. He was formal like that sometimes when he was being serious, and he said, 'I'll bring him back safe, Pauline.' And I believed him." She had not seen Elias again until he walked past her porch in April of 1916, alone, on his way back from Munn's store. "I wanted to call out to him," she said. "I was going to ask him about James, but something about the way he was walking, I don't know how to say it exactly. It was like he was trying not to disturb the air, like he was afraid that if he made too much noise, something would notice him." She had not called out. She had waited, she said, for him to come to her. He never did. New Mexico Territory and points between 1914 for 1916. This is the section of the Reconstruction where the historian must be most careful and most honest about the limits of what can be known. We do not have a continuous record of the Cord Party's movements between December 1914 and April 1916. What we have are fragments, a boarding house registry in Albuquerque that lists E, Cord and Party, 9 men in March of 1915, which tells us that by that point, the group had already shrunk by 3. A letter from a labor contractor in southern New Mexico, addressed to a Harlan County resident named Josiah Teague, Solomon's father, that mentions your son and his associates as having been employed on a railroad grading project in the summer of 1915, and a report from the sheriff of Doña Ana County, New Mexico, dated November 1915, that references a disturbance involving a group of Kentucky men without specifying the nature of the disturbance or its outcome. This report, 2 pages of which exist, with a third apparently missing or destroyed, is the most significant surviving document of the entire affair, and it has been examined by every researcher who has subsequently looked at this case. What it tells us is limited but suggestive. It establishes that by November 1915, there were surviving members of the group in Doña Ana County. It establishes that something had happened that required the attention of law enforcement. It establishes that the sheriff spoke to at least one member of the group, described in the report as a Kentucky man, calm, who stated the matter was settled and asked no further inquiry be made. The name of this individual is not given. The nature of the disturbance is not described. The 3rd page of the report, which presumably contained the details, is not in the archive. It was not lost by accident. The archivist at the New Mexico State Records Center, who reviewed the file in 2001, noted in her catalog entry that the binding of the folder showed evidence of pages having been deliberately removed, and that this had likely occurred sometime in the 1920s or 1930s, when several county records of the period were reviewed and in some cases quietly reorganized. By whom, and on whose instruction, is unknown. What we can reconstruct with somewhat more confidence is the last confirmed moment when Elias Cord and any of the other members of his party were in the same documented location. The Albuquerque boarding house registry from March 1915, which we have already mentioned, lists 9 names. Elias Cord is one. The others, to the extent that they can be cross-referenced with the names of the men who left Harlan County, include Ned Cord, James Reardon, Harold Munn, Absalom Hensley, and Roy Combs. 3 names on the registry do not match any of the men we can identify from the original party, suggesting that the group had acquired additional travelers, or that the names were recorded incorrectly, or that some of the men were using names other than their own. This last possibility is not, given the general practice of itinerant labor in the period, as strange as it might seem. At some point after March 1915, the group moved south. The railroad grading project referenced in the contractor's letter places them in the Mesilla Valley region by June. After that, the documented record goes almost entirely dark. What we have is inference and testimony. The inference, something happened in the autumn of 1915. The disturbance noted in the sheriff's report is the proximate marker. By February 1916, Ned Cord was dead. By April 1916, Elias Cord was back in Harlan County. The arithmetic of these dates suggests that between November 1915 and February 1916, approximately 3 months of events occurred that reduced 12 men to 1, or rather, that completed a reduction that had apparently been ongoing since at least March 1915, when only 9 of the original 12 could be placed at the same location. The testimony: in 1931, a man named Warren Dill, who had worked on railroad construction in southern New Mexico in 1915, gave an interview to a journalist from the El Paso Herald-Post who was following up on an unrelated story about labor conditions in the region. In the course of that interview, Dill mentioned, apparently without attaching great significance to it, that he had once worked alongside a group of Kentucky men who had gotten into something bad with a contractor, and that most of them hadn't made it out of the territory. The journalist asked what had happened. Dill said he didn't know the details, that he'd heard different things, and that the one man he'd spoken to about it afterward, a tall, quiet man from the group who had been around for a few weeks before disappearing, had said only that it was done, and there was nothing to be gained by going over it. The journalist asked if he remembered the tall man's name. Dill thought about it. He said the man had told him his name was Elias, and that he was from Kentucky, and that he was going home. This is the closest we come to Elias Cord's own voice in the period between his departure and his return. One sentence, recorded secondhand 15 years after it was spoken, filtered through a journalist's notes that were themselves summarized in a clipping that only survived because a researcher found it in a scrapbook in 2003. It was done, and there was nothing to be gained by going over it. He was perhaps 33 years old when he said it. He had been in the territory for more than a year. He was preparing to go home. He had, at minimum, watched his brother die and outlived 10 other men with whom he had made a promise of mutual care and return. And he had already, in the cold of a New Mexico winter, made the decision that would govern the rest of his life. We do not know what happened. We must be unambiguous about this. We do not know whether the men died through violence, through accident, through disease, through the kind of labor exploitation that was routine and barely illegal in that period and in that place, or through some combination of circumstances that does not fit neatly into any single category. We do not know whether Elias Cord made choices that contributed to their deaths, or whether he made choices that prevented his own death without being able to prevent theirs, or whether he simply survived what they did not through the arbitrary cruelty of circumstance. We do not know whether there were other people involved, contractors, other workers, officials, landowners, whose guilt or involvement might have been part of what he was protecting by staying silent. We do not know. This is not a failure of the research. It is the research's central finding. What we know is that Elias Cord stood somewhere in the desert country of southern New Mexico in the winter of 1915 or 1916, perhaps in the cold November of the sheriff's report, perhaps in the bleak February of his brother's death, perhaps in the gray nothing of the weeks between, and looked at what had happened, and decided what he would do with it, and what he decided was silence. The last confirmed moment when Elias Cord and Ned Cord were in the same location is, as best we can determine, sometime in the autumn of 1915. A man named George Pettifer, who had worked as a mule skinner for the same railroad contractor referenced in the Teague letter, told his granddaughter, who recorded the story in a family memoir written in 1987, a copy of which was provided to the Harlan County Historical Society, that he had seen 2 brothers from Kentucky sitting together outside a work camp one evening, not talking, just sitting. Grandpa said the younger one looked sick, the granddaughter wrote, relaying the story, and the older one kept looking at him like he was trying to memorize his face, like he knew something the younger one didn't. Pettifer had not known their names. He had not spoken to them. He had simply seen them, noted the quality of the moment, and carried it with him long enough to tell his granddaughter about it somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, in a living room 1,000 miles from where it had happened. The detail that catches is the memorizing, the looking as though to preserve something, as though Elias Cord, in that autumn evening in New Mexico, already understood that his brother was not going to come home, and was doing the only thing left available to him, remembering. Harlan County, Kentucky, 1916-1930. The pressure on Elias Cord to speak began almost immediately upon his return and did not abate significantly for at least a decade. It came from multiple directions, with different textures and different motives, and he absorbed it all with the same quality of stillness that had apparently been forming in him since before he'd left New Mexico. He was not rude to those who asked. He was not defensive. He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily courteous in his refusals, which made the refusals more difficult to challenge and more troubling to receive. Chester Reardon was the most persistent. James Reardon's father was a man of 61 in 1916, a small farmer whose two sons, James and Caleb both, had gone with the Cord party and neither had returned. He was, by the descriptions of those who knew him, a formidable man in the old county sense, not large or violent, but possessed of a moral seriousness that made people feel they owed him honesty. He had built things and lost things, and conducted himself with a dignity that the community recognized and respected. He came to Elias Cord's house 4 times in the summer of 1916. Elias received him each time. They sat on the porch or inside at the kitchen table when the weather was bad. Reardon asked his questions. Elias listened to every one of them with what multiple later accounts describe as complete attention, not the restless, uncomfortable attention of a man buying time, but the focused attention of a man who took the questions seriously and was thinking carefully about each one before he declined to answer it. He wasn't cold about it, said a neighbor named Hazel Combs, whose husband was a cousin of Roy and Dillard Combs, and who had observed one of these visits. That's what made it hard. If he'd been cold, you could have hated him for it. But he looked at Chester like he cared about him, like he was sorry, but he still wouldn't say. After the 4th visit, Chester Reardon went to the sheriff. The sheriff of Harlan County in 1916 was a man named Burl Estes, and his 2 interviews with Elias Cord, conducted in June and August of that year, are summarized in the sheriff's own hand in the county records, and it is worth quoting the relevant portion of those summaries at some length, because they reveal something important about the nature of what Elias was and was not saying. From the June summary, subject stated he had traveled with the men named and that all had parted company before his return. He stated he did not know the present location or condition of the others. He stated he had received no communication from any of them since parting. He was asked if he had any reason to believe any of the men had come to harm. He stated he could not say. He was asked if he had witnessed any violence or accident involving the men. He stated he could not say. He was cooperative in manner and answered all questions put to him, but the answers were of a kind that gave nothing. From the August summary, 2nd interview with E. Cord. Cord was again cooperative and again provided nothing of use. He was asked directly if he knew what had happened to the Reardon boys. He said he was not able to tell me. I asked him to clarify whether he meant he didn't know or meant he wouldn't say. He was quiet for a time and then said there was no difference that he could make useful. I have no grounds to hold or charge him. That last note, there was no difference that he could make useful, is the kind of sentence that a careful man produces when he has thought very hard about what he is and is not willing to let into the world. It is not evasion. It is, in its compressed and difficult way, almost a kind of precision. The difference between I don't know and I won't say is real, and Elias understood this better than anyone in that room. His decision not to distinguish between them was itself a choice, a careful, deliberate refusal to give the investigators a thread to pull. The sheriff did not pursue the matter further. He had no body, no crime with a fixed location, no jurisdiction beyond his county, and a witness who was too careful to provide a pretext for arrest, and too honest to simply lie. There was, as far as the record shows, no further official inquiry. Chester Reardon did not give up as easily as the sheriff. In the autumn of 1916, he attempted to contact the sheriff of Doña Ana County, New Mexico, by letter. The response he received, which does not survive in the Reardon family papers but is referenced in a letter Chester wrote to his daughter in 1917, apparently indicated that no record of the relevant disturbance could be located and that the county had no information about any Kentucky men that would be useful to him. In 1917, Chester traveled to New Mexico himself. He was 62 years old and had never been further west than Tennessee. He spent 6 weeks in the territory, visiting labor camps and county offices and talking to anyone who would listen. He returned, by his daughter's account, looking older than when he had left and saying very little about what he had found. He found, she believed, enough to be certain that something terrible had happened, and not enough to know what it was, or who was responsible, or whether Elias Cord could have prevented it. He came back to Harlan County and went to see Elias Cord one more time. This visit was the last. The daughter could not say what was said, because she had not been there and her father had not told her. What she knew was that when Chester Reardon came home that evening, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "He looked at me the whole time. He never looked away once. And then he did not speak of it again." Chester Reardon died in 1924. His daughter, Emma Reardon Pratt, lived until 1971. She gave Albert Prewitt the interview we have already quoted, and at the end of it, she said something that the graduate student recorded verbatim in his notes. "My father died believing Elias Cord knew exactly what happened to my brothers," she said, "and I believe the same thing. But here's what I've spent my life trying to work out. I also believe that whatever Elias knew, he had a reason for keeping it. Whether that reason was good enough, that's what I can't settle." She asked Prewitt if he could settle it. He said he didn't know yet. He never completed the thesis. The years between 1916 and 1930 are not, for Elias Cord, a period of obvious suffering. This is important to establish because the temptation of retrospective interpretation is to see his silence as wound, his quietness as damage, his restraint as the sign of a man haunted in the conventional sense. The surviving evidence does not entirely support this reading. He was changed, certainly. The laugh that Cora Bledsoe remembered, the one that came out before he'd decided whether a thing was funny, does not appear again in any testimony after 1916. He was quieter. He was more careful with his words. A deacon who served alongside him from 1928 onward, a man named Emmett Proffitt, described him to a local historian in 1962 as a man who listened more than he talked, but who you could trust absolutely. The word trust recurs with unusual frequency in descriptions of Elias Cord in this period. People trusted him with their animals, their disputes, their small secrets, their practical problems. He was, it seems, the man you went to when you needed something handled quietly. There is an irony in this that is difficult to avoid. A man whose defining act was a refusal to handle his own story was apparently the person his community relied upon to handle theirs. He knew how to keep things contained. He knew the value and the cost of silence. And he applied that knowledge in service of his neighbors for the rest of his life with a consistency that those neighbors experienced as generosity. Whether it also served as penance is not a question the record can answer. The marriage, 1920 to 1923, a woman named Verna Hatfield, no children, ended by divorce in a county where divorce was sufficiently uncommon to be noted and discussed, is a part of the record that we have the least access to. Verna Hatfield remarried and moved away and was not, in any interview we have been able to locate, asked about Elias Cord. The divorce record states only irreconcilable differences, which in that time and place could mean almost anything, and most likely means that she had asked him something she needed answered, and he had not answered it, and the distance between the question and the silence had eventually become wider than a marriage could sustain. This is inference. It should be marked as such, but it is not, given everything else we know about this man. Implausible inference. By the late 1920s, the active social pressure on Elias Cord to speak had largely subsided. Chester Reardon was dead. The sheriff who had questioned him had retired and moved to Lexington. The other families of the men who had gone, the Munns, the Teagues, the Henleys, the Combses, had reached each in their own way whatever accommodation with uncertainty was available to them. Some believed Elias was guilty of something. Some believed he was simply the fortunate one. Some, like Hazel Combs, seemed to have arrived at something more complicated, a recognition that guilt and innocence and fortune and choice were not cleanly separable in what had happened, and that demanding a clean answer was perhaps asking for something the situation did not contain. Life had continued. The coal companies had continued their consolidation. There had been a world war. The flu had come through. Children had been born. The county had changed in ways that made the winter of 1914 feel, to those who had not been directly affected, increasingly distant. Elias Cord continued to farm his land, serve his church, and maintain his silence with the patient, practiced consistency of a man who had long since made his peace with the choice and no longer needed to work at keeping it. Or so he appeared. A historian's conclusion on what the silence contains. It is now possible and necessary to say clearly what this reconstruction cannot prove but has been building across the preceding 4 sections to assert. Elias Cord's silence was not the silence of trauma, though trauma was undoubtedly present. It was not the silence of guilt in the simple legal sense, though guilt in some form was almost certainly there too. It was not the silence of a man who lacked the words or lacked the courage or lacked the occasion to speak. It was the silence of a man who had made a calculation. The calculation was this: the full truth of what had happened in southern New Mexico in 1915 and 1916, whatever that full truth contained, would, if spoken, cause more damage than the silence. Not damage to Elias Cord himself. His own suffering, his own reputation, his own legal jeopardy was not, based on the behavioral evidence we have examined, the thing he was primarily protecting. He was too careful for self-interest to be the only motive, and self-interest alone does not explain the quality of attention he gave to those who came to him, the gentleness of his refusals, the apologies he offered without the information the apologies were meant to accompany. He was protecting something, or someone, or some set of consequences he had traced forward in his mind and found intolerable. Let us consider what the silence might have contained. The most straightforward possibility, the one that requires the fewest additional assumptions, is that some or all of the men died as a result of circumstances that involved identifiable responsible parties. A labor contractor who had cheated them or endangered them, or done something worse. Local authorities who had been involved or had been paid to look away. Property owners or other workers, or some configuration of power and violence that was specific enough to name and dangerous enough in 1916 to remain unnamed. If this is what Elias knew, then his silence makes practical sense of a particular kind. Naming names in a situation like that, in that period, in a part of the country where the men he would be naming likely still lived and worked, was not simply a matter of pursuing justice. It was a matter of survival, his own, and potentially the survival of the families of the men who had died. Chester Reardon going to New Mexico to ask questions could get Chester Reardon hurt. Elias talking to the sheriff could put people at risk whom Elias felt responsible for protecting. This is not an implausible reading. The period in question was one in which labor violence was real, in which contractors operated with impunity in remote territories, in which the distance between eastern Kentucky and southern New Mexico was sufficient to make retaliation both deniable and practical. But there is a second possibility that the evidence does not allow us to dismiss, and it is the one that those who have examined this case most closely, Doris Feltner at the Harlan County Historical Society, the incomplete Albert Prewitt, and now this reconstruction, have been most reluctant to look at directly. The second possibility is that something happened among the men themselves. 12 men traveling together for more than a year, under conditions of physical hardship, financial desperation, and the specific psychological pressure of being far from home with no clear path back, is a situation that produces its own kinds of violence. Men who love each other, and these men did, by all evidence, love each other, or at least the kind of trust that functions like love in difficult circumstances, can, under the right conditions of despair and fear and exhaustion and hunger, do things to each other that none of them would have predicted and none of them could afterward describe without destroying everything that had come before and after. If something like this is what Elias Cord witnessed, or participated in, or survived, then the nature of his silence is different. It is not the silence of a man protecting himself from legal consequences, because by the 1920s, the legal window had largely passed and the protective silence had long outlived its practical utility. It is the silence of a man protecting something more fragile and more essential, the right of the dead to be remembered as they were before, and not only as they were at the end. Chester Reardon wanted to know what happened to his sons. Elias Cord may have understood, with a clarity that Chester could not have, that what Chester actually wanted was his sons back, and that what Elias could offer was not that. What Elias could offer was a version of James and Caleb Reardon that stopped before the worst of it. What speaking would have offered Chester was the worst of it, with nothing else. The silence, in this reading, was not a wall. It was a gift. A brutal and unasked for gift, but a gift nonetheless. The gift of not knowing, which is different from ignorance, which is different from nothing. Doris Feltner, the curator whose unpublished manuscript has been referenced throughout this reconstruction, wrote in her conclusion something that has stayed with every subsequent researcher who has read it. "I have spent several years now in the company of Elias Cord's silence," she wrote, "and I have come to believe that the silence was the most honest thing he did. Not because telling the truth would have been wrong, but because he understood something that most of us, fortunately, are never required to understand. That there are events which the truth cannot improve, and which speaking about makes worse, and which the world, not the court, not the family, not the historian, is not actually better for knowing. He made a choice that cost him enormously and cost the families of those men in a different way. Whether we can call that choice right or wrong, I genuinely don't know. What I know is that it was not made carelessly. It was the most careful thing he ever did." She finished the manuscript in 1974. She left it unfinished in the sense that she had not resolved the central question in the Historical Society's collection, where it was filed under Cord, Elias, Miscellaneous. She died in 1981. The manuscript was not published. The question was not resolved. Elias Cord died on September 12, 1949. The cause of death is listed in county records as heart failure. He was 67 years old. His surviving brother Thomas, who had stayed home with his broken leg in 1914 and had lived with the consequences of that accident's mercy ever since, was at his bedside. Thomas Cord would describe that death to a reporter the following year in terms that were brief, and that the reporter, perhaps sensing their weight, did not push further. "He went quiet," Thomas said. "He'd been quiet a long time, so it was hard to tell at first when it changed. He was asked if Elias had said anything in the end. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He said Ned's name," Thomas said, "once, like he was answering somebody. The reporter asked who he might have been answering. Thomas said he didn't know. The house Elias Cord built with his own hands was demolished in 1961 to make way for a road expansion. The lot sat empty for several years and was eventually incorporated into a neighboring property. The ridge he had looked out at from his bedroom window is still there, as ridges tend to be, unchanged in any way that would be visible to someone who had not known what it once meant to look out at it. There is no marker. There is no official record of what he saw or knew. There is no testimony from his own hand or his own mouth that adds anything to the fragments we have assembled here. What we have is the shape of a silence, its dimensions traced by the questions that surrounded it, the people who pressed against it from the outside, the institutional records that came close to it, and then went quiet themselves. We can measure the silence by what it displaced, the testimony that was never given, the letters that were never written, the sheriff's report that lost its third page, the thesis that was never finished, the question that Emma Reardon Pratt carried to her death without settling. We cannot see inside it. This is not a failure of research. It is, I have come to believe, the point. The silence is the ending. The silence was always the ending. Elias Cord made sure of that, with the same patience and the same care that he brought to everything else in his life after 1916. The deacon's duties, the neighbor's fence, the borrowed tool returned, the question answered with a look that held nothing you could use. He lived 33 years after coming home. He spent those 33 years being, by all accounts, a decent man. He helped people. He kept their secrets. He showed up when he was needed. He did not lie. He simply did not speak about the one thing that everyone who knew him understood, at some level, that he knew. Whether that silence was right is not a question this reconstruction can answer. It may not be a question that any framework we currently possess is equipped to answer. The law would say one thing. The families would say another. The church he served would say a third. Elias Cord said nothing, and went on living in the way that people do when they have absorbed something enormous and decided, against every social pressure available, to carry it alone. He told Warren Dill, in the winter of 1915 or 1916, in the cold of a New Mexico territory that had taken everything from him, that it was done, and there was nothing to be gained by going over it. He spent the rest of his life proving that he meant it. This reconstruction is based on partial documentary records held at the Harlan County Historical Society, the Kentucky Baptist Convention Archives, the New Mexico State Record Center, the unpublished Feltner manuscript, 1974, the incomplete Prewitt interview transcripts, 1958, and various secondary accounts. Several documents referenced herein cannot be independently verified. The central events remain unresolved. The central figure remains silent. This is not expected to change.